what, they're persistent if nothing else. I love this because I can go home and put another log on the fire and I don't have to go jump in a plow truck. It's been a couple of years since I've had to do that, and I'll tell you what, nights like this, this is going to be a night. This would have been one of those night shift hell nights where you just go out all night long. Temperatures drop, there's ice everywhere, the roads are nasty. And can't keep them bare, so big trucks are going to be slipping and sliding all over the place. Did many a night like this. And I'm going to go home. You can hear the salt hitting out of the truck. They plastered this road. Of course, that's what happens. Yep, now we got the drifting. Look at that. Well, it's cold out, so pretty much anything I had planned to do outside has come to an end. Just simply single-digit temperatures are not good for me at my advanced age. So what a perfect time to go both into the saw shop and up into the train room. So today is going to be train room, I think, because I want to stay warm. And I've been working on these old ALCOs now for quite some time. Mainly because when I was a kid, the first Lionel locomotive I ever had was that New Haven 232, which I've displayed on previous videos. And being a little bit older now, well, okay, quite a bit older now, you go back and actually research things. Two things have come to my mind that are kind of interesting, you know, from a hobby perspective. First is the history of the ALCO FAs in of itself, you know. For some, it's sort of a sad story because it typifies what happened in industrial America in the years after the Second World War, and I guess to a certain extent throughout our industrial history, where you have the interaction of large companies and unions and pressures to produce product, you know, generate income, get product to market. And ALCO kind of got the bad end of the deal when essentially the U.S. government suppressed their diesel production and development during the Second World War because the wartime priorities were moving freight, and at the time ALCO was probably and arguably the most successful of the steam locomotive manufacturers of their time. Some will say Baldwin, others will say a variety of other companies, but ALCO really was one of the four best steam locomotive manufacturers in American history. And during the Second World War, moving materials was of high priority, so they were pretty much tasked with continuing to do what they did well. Meanwhile, General Motors and EMD were off developing that two-stroke of theirs, which is like a big Detroit diesel, just larger. And it was a better design from my perspective because I like two-strokes. But they also had the benefit of being able to focus on that design and developing it to a very reliable state. So now ALCO, the war is over, the restrictions are lifted, are tasked with trying to get back up to the rest of the competition in order to stay in business, which they kind of did. But the ALCO FA was one of their early It wasn't their earliest offering, but it was one of their earlier offerings that came into being just towards the later part of the Second World War, and then their first major offering after the Second World War. So they kind of try to get things done quickly, and the storyline is their first diesel they used in the FA, the 244s, had a whole bunch of issues from basic design flaws because they didn't have time to develop it enough, and also manufacturing and supply issues as well. And that really points to a whole supply chain that spanned across New York State that they were drawing from Auburn, New York, all the way east to Albany. And as the country came back up on its feet and converted back to peacetime manufacturing type priorities, ALCO was also trying to get up and going and trying to maintain some level of share in the marketplace. And they rushed to market with the 244 and the ALCO FA, and it was one step short of a disaster for them. And some people argue it was the demise of the company. I'm not going to go there because, you know, if anyone watches my saw channel, pretty much the same kind of story goes with the chainsaws as well, but that's another deal. Anyway, so that's interesting. I mean, that's a history all in itself, and to me, I think that's something that's a lot of people should go back and take a quick look at. It's really, really interesting history, especially if you're a New Yorker and you want to know what happened. The second part of that is how the ALCOs played in the model train world. Lionel as well, coming out of the Second World War, all kinds of new manufacturing techniques and all kinds of desire to grow into the marketplace with them new exciting product lines. And they also came up with, well, obviously the EMD F3 series, which was a wild success. You know, the Santa Fe war bonnet and all that. And the Scale Hudson and a whole bunch of other products that they had come up with in the 40s into the 50s as they evolved into a more modern state of affairs. And they also came up with the ALCO design, the ALCO FA in the 1950s. It was kind of a different design than what I'm collecting. I'm collecting the sheet metal frame. They were the die-cast versions. Not going to go there today, but Lionel also had to come up with interesting shells and road names. They did, I think. But the interesting thing for me was they had to come up with what I want to call fantasy flags versus actual railroad shells and paintings that reflected what in fact happened in history. So, for example, New York Central did buy a whole bunch of them, and they were black. So they had the typical New York Central variety of paint jobs, and they were one of the major customers for ALCO, and also one of the major users of the FA series, FA1s and FA2s. Union Pacific did as well. Missouri Pacific had them. I'm not sure they had them in that baby blue, but they also had purchased those ALCO car body units. I can't find any record of a Chesapeake, Ohio FA1 or FA2. B&O did, but not C&O. I can't find any record of a war bonnet style Santa Fe with an ALCO FA1 or FA2. They certainly did with the PA. Can't find any record of a Texas Special ALCO FA1 or FA2. And I certainly can't find any record of a Rio Grande FA1, FA2 in this color scheme. So Lionel basically would put out those shells as much because of the aesthetics, somewhat, you know, related to something it might have in history, not trying to be prototypical and certainly not trying to be accurate. And then I think that's a storyline of itself. What do you do? You know? So what I wanted to do was focus on running the Fantasy Flag ALCOs for the next couple of videos, and then eventually see if I can come up with some better New York Central colored shells and maybe paint some Lehigh Valley and Erie and things like that, because those companies were the ones that actually used that FA1, FA2 series of locomotives. New York Central in particular. The Pennsylvania railroads, like, well, Pennsylvania Railroad did, but the Reading did, Lehigh Valley did. There's a bunch of them in that area of the world that really did rely pretty heavily on these things. And I guess the final point before I start doing my train run of Fantasy Flag ALCOs is, as bad as the launch of that 244 series of ALCO diesel was, they sure made a lot of them, and they sure moved a lot of passengers and a lot of freight. So while they were not nearly as successful and they were a big pain in the neck as compared to the EMD offering at the time, they did a lot of work. You know, you can go back and look at the history and look at the picture books, and there were a lot of them on the New York Central and the Eastern railroads, for sure. So again, there's a lot of the fantasy flag ALCOs, and I'm going to run some of those just for fun. I want to focus on that. And again, for me, it's not about being prototypical. It's just running model trains and toy trains in my case. And so these here, in my mind, from what I've done so far for research, are fantasy flag locomotives. And I do believe, whether or not in this color scheme or not, Missouri Pacific, Union Pacific, and of course New York Central certainly had a lot of them, along with the Pennsylvania railroads hauling coal, like the Erie, and then eventually Erie-Lackawanna, and Lehigh Valley. Even Pennsylvania Railroad had plenty of those old first generation car body ALCOs. Now, this one right here is interesting in the sense that, from the research I've done, that paint scheme was famous on the ALCO PA, not the FAs, right? And they did have those for quite some time. But Delaware and Hudson actually had, and I'm not sure what the paint scheme was, some of the first ALCO FA1 test units for a period of time when they were trying to get some runtime on them. Not sure they ever bought any until they got to the PAs. I believe the Delaware and Hudson is a fantasy paint scheme on an ALCO FA as well. I know that paint scheme showed up on the PAs, but I think it was a fantasy scheme on the FAs. In the Montreal Motorworks version of that, the Canadian National used quite a few of those, so they existed up there. I'm not finding any Boston and Maine ALCO history at all, in the first ones. Now, one of the things that may have happened on some of these is obviously after they got used by their original owners and then they got sold, of course they get sent to the second tier railroads and get repainted in their own scheme. I don't have any records of that. So it's possible, while none of these fantasy flags look this way for a new ALCO coming out of the shop, that there might be instances where ALCOs had run the end of their service life for a particular railroad and got sold off and then bought up and repainted in a different scheme. I'm not going to argue that case. That's possible. I just don't have any records of it. So, but that's part of the fun, isn't it? Learning a little bit about the railroads, the American history part of it, the mechanical side of it, the ALCO diesels, the 244s, and eventually the 251s. And when they got reliable, then there was the FA4s, where they put the 251 version of their diesel in there. They did work pretty well, but by that time, that style of diesel locomotive had been pretty much replaced by the road switchers, the RS11s and things like that. Of course, there was the EMD GP 7s and 9s that pretty much had taken over a lot of the freight service by that point in time. So anyway, let's go do some train run. See if I can come up with some different camera angles. And just want to say to all the people who are here watching YouTube videos because it's too cold outside, stay warm, stay dry, happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, whatever happens to be your way, and enjoy. And thank you very much for watching. So the one theory I have on why Lionel had so many of these fantasy flag road names on the ALCO FAs is this. It's like with the Texas Special. Most of them had the EMD diesels, and I think they were E7s or E8s, something along those lines. But they actually had one in a similar paint scheme that was an ALCO PA, not an FA. Santa Fe had a war bonnet painted ALCO PA as well. So Lionel picked up those paint schemes, and for the lower cost 027 product offerings, they put those fancier paint schemes on the FA series here, which I guess corresponds to the lower cost offerings that these were, but they wanted to have the fancier paint jobs from the fancier road names. But in reality, the FA was just a freight locomotive. It was just a heavy freight locomotive. They'd stack them up to get the power and traction they needed. And I don't really see a lot of evidence that they were used much in passenger service at all.